very successful. Well, my topic, I'll just it's do Ukraine, Crete, Kosovo, local and global dimensions of Serbian Orthodox antagonism in the 21st century. A broad coverage of the themes mentioned in the title of this presentation have purpose to detect challenges that the Serbian Orthodox Church have met in the last decades. The reference to Ukraine are twofold: to the war that broke out in the country in 2014, and to the unilateral decision of the Constantinopolitan Patriarch Bartholomew to recognize one of the schismatic Orthodox ecclesial groups in Ukraine as a full member of the Orthodox Church worldwide in 2018. The reference to Crete is actually the reference to the Council of Orthodox Church, officially called the Holy and Great Council, organized by Ecumenical Patriarchate in the Cretan village of Columbari in June 2016, and attended by the representatives of majority of local Orthodox churches. The reference to Montenegro are also twofold. Firstly, they are references to the controversial law on freedom of religion signed by Montenegro's President Milo Đukanović in December 2019, which declared all the churches and properties of the Serbian Orthodox Church built in Montenegro prior 1918 as the property of the state. Secondly, they are references to appropriate actions taken by the Serbian Church in Montenegro to protect its property through massive rallies and its backing of political opposition to President Đukanović and his party at the parliamentary elections in August 2020. Finally, the references to Kosovo pertains to a long-standing international conflict about the status of Kosovo, which unilaterally declared independence from Serbia in 2008, and it was recognized by the USA, the UK, and the most of European countries, but not by Serbia, Russia, China, and majority of member countries in the United Nations. But also these are references to policy of the Serbian Orthodox Church toward the Kosovo independence. Although it was not transparent from the title of this presentation, my focus will also be on the recently elected patriarch and the future perspective of the SOC. Well, the Maidan protest, the secession of Crimea, and the armed conflict in Donetsk and Lugansk were one-dimensionally interpreted by the hierarchs of the Serbian Church, usually through the prism of NATO military involvement in Kosovo and consequent crisis over the status of this province. Late Metropolitan of Montenegro, Amfilohije Radović, who just died last year, accused NATO members for implementing dividing and conquering policy on Ukrainians and Russians living in Ukraine. For a majority of Serbian people, but also for considerable member of international media, and comparison between the events in Ukraine when the USA and the EU considered the Crimean proclamation of independence illegal, and the role they play in supporting Kosovo independence seems to be application of double standards. Since the approach of the Serbian Church to Ukrainian crisis was one-dimensional, many important issues for the future of global orthodoxy escape its view. First and foremost, they overlook the values the protesters of Kiev and Maidan stood for, such as human dignity and honesty, nonviolence, solidarity, and readiness for self-sacrifice, which are also the values that many Ukrainian Christians and churches shared. However, there were other characteristics of the churches involved in Maidan other than the sacrificial one. such as readiness to serve to the imperial and national ideologies. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate remained loyal to the imperial concerns of the Russian state, which were presented as a faithfulness to canonical order and ecclesial jurisdiction. Many churchgoers in Donetsk and Crimea, as native Russians, embraced Russian nationalism, while many Ukrainian churchgoers opted for Ukrainian nationalism. One of the supreme goals of Ukrainian state and society was to back up its political and ecclesial independence from Moscow by establishing a national church. The situation in Serbian church in many respects resembled the situation in Ukraine. The Serbian church was considered as an instrument of Serbian nationalism and a political intruder into ex-Yugoslav countries, Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, and Montenegro. In both countries were established local national churches, such as Macedonian Orthodox Church and Montenegrin Orthodox Church, and they were supported by secular authorities in those countries, but they remain unrecognized by other canonical Orthodox churches. It was expected from the long-awaited Pan-Orthodox Council as a supreme authority to solve the problem of the autocephaly of newly established local churches. However, there was a strong tendency already at the meeting of the primates of the Orthodox churches held in March 2014 in Fanar to exclude the topics of autocephaly and diptych from the council agenda, although the Serbian Orthodox Church continued to insist on the need to discuss these issues. Unlike the Russian Orthodox Church, which constantly attempted to avoid discussion on the topic of autocephaly of Orthodox Church in Ukraine, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the issue Macedonian Orthodox Church, for the Serbian Orthodox Church, the issue Macedonian Orthodox Church was an urgent matter. The Serbian Church has adhered to the theological stance that any local Orthodox Church, as a mother church, may grant the autonomous status to its part, but a new ecclesial body can gain the autocephalous status only after being accepted by all local churches at the Pan-Orthodox Council. By the Nice Agreement from the 17th of May 2002, the Serbian Orthodox Church granted autonomous status to the Macedonian Church, which was in schism with the Serbian Church since 1959. The 16th article of this agreement granted right to Macedonian Orthodox Church to partake in all Pan-Orthodox conferences and with the blessing of ecumenical patriarch in the meetings of primates of the autocephalous and autonomous churches. This agreement was rejected by a majority of Macedonian bishops, while those who remained loyal to the document and did not break the unity with the Serbian Orthodox Church, such as Metropolitan John of Veles and Povardarje, were persecuted later by Macedonian authorities for alleged financial frauds. The letter of Patriarch Irene to the primates of Orthodox churches from the 25th of May 2016, the Serbian Orthodox Church insisted once more to discuss the question of autocephaly at the Council of Crete, the right of bishops to vote at the Council, and the ecumenical status of the councils from the 9th and 14th century. It would be wrong then to conclude that hesitation of the Serbian Orthodox Church to attend the Council of Crete expressed in the letters of the Serbian Patriarch Irene to the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew from the 6th of June 2016 and in the Serbian Orthodox Church statement from the 15th of June 2016 was backing up the position of Russian Orthodox Church, because the Serbian Church welcomed the discussion on autocephaly while the Russian Church avoided it. The main reason for potential absence of the Serbian Orthodox Church from Crete was Council Code of Regulation, which took into account only the votes of the primates, but not the votes of other 24 members of each delegation. The consequence of such a voting system might have been acceptance of certain documents by Council, even if they did not receive the majority of the votes. Luckily, this did not happen at the Council of Crete, and all the documents were accepted by majority. Although the question of autocephaly was avoided at the Council of Crete, it was confirmed in the encyclical of the Council that there are 14 local autocephalous churches and, quote, that the principle of autocephaly cannot be allowed to operate at the expense of the principle of the Catholicity and the unity of the Church, end of quote. According to Metropolitan Amphilochi of Montenegro, this particularly meant that any of these 14 local autocephalous churches are not under the jurisdiction of any mother church, and that they are responsible only to the pleroma and Catholicity. This was also in concord with the decision of Pan-Orthodox Conference from 2009, which decided that Tomos of autocephaly is issued after a local church as a mother church propose autonomous status for one or more of its part, and all local churches accept this by consensus. It remained as an open question how to sign the Tomos for autocephaly. The Macedonian Church have rightly understood the decision of Cretan Council when in summer 2017 sent an official request to the Bulgarian Orthodox Church to become its mother church and to encourage other Orthodox churches to accept it as equal. The issue of autocephaly emerged in full scale when the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew issued a Tomos of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine in December 2019 and proclaimed bishops of formerly schismatic Patriarchate of Kiev, entitled now as Orthodox Church in Ukraine and headed by Metropolitan Epiphanius of Kiev and the whole Ukraine, as the only canonical Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Leaving aside all questions of Russian fanariot imperialism and Ukrainian and Russian nationalism, the claim of Patriarch Bartholomew to bear exclusive responsibility for granting autocephaly, as well the privilege to treat all ecclesial issues without limits, as it is stated in the letter of Patriarch John, to Patriarch John of Antioch from the 24th of December 2018, was perceived by many theologians as neo-papal tendency in Orthodox Church. Some politicians in the Balkans responded quickly to ecumenical patriarch's claim to be sole authority in the Orthodox Church with appropriate actions. Similarly to former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, President of Montenegro Milo Djukanovic and Prime Minister of North Macedonia Zoran Zaev requested from Patriarch Bartholomew to recognize the uncanonical Orthodox churches in their countries. For both national leaders, autocephaly of their churches served to strengthen their independence from Belgrade, although not necessarily from Fanar or Sofia in case of Macedonia, and to solidify the national identities of their people. In Montenegro, as well as in North Macedonia and Kosovo, the Serbian Orthodox Church is still recognized as the last instrument of Serbian imperial domination from Yugoslav era. The Montenegrin president, Milo Djukanovic, prompted his policy against the Metropolitanate of Montenegro and littoral of the Serbian Orthodox Church in three directions: by continuously labeling Metropolitanate of Montenegro as a proponent of foreign interests, Serbian and Russian, and by exponent of Serbian nationalism. B, by signing controversial law on freedom of religion in December 2019, which ought to confiscate all Serbian church properties, churches and buildings built prior 1918, and C, by establishing a new Orthodox Church of Montenegro and seeking its recognition from the Ecumenical Patriarch. The defense of Metropolitanate went also in several directions. First, representatives of the Metropolitanate, such as priest Gojko Perović, insisted that the status of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro is not a national issue of Serbian people, but a democratic issue of the discriminated Montenegrin citizens. Second, the Metropolitanate of Montenegro organized against the controversial law the public prayers and religious procession on the daily basis for several months at the beginning of 2020, which were supported not only by Orthodox believers, but also by Catholics, Muslims, and atheists. Finally, Metropolitanate proposed University Professor Zdravko Krivokapić to be the leader of opposition parties' coalition and invited its believers and supporters to vote for this coalition at the parliamentary election held in the 30th of August 2020. The voter turnout was massive, and the opposition parties overthrew Đukanović's party from power after 30 years. Finally, the problematic articles about confiscation of the Serbian Orthodox Church property in the law on freedom of religion were changed by Montenegrin parliament. A more important issue than protecting its property is a great potential in the process of building democratic and law-abiding society that the SOC has shown. The issue of Kosovo is of the greatest importance for the Serbian Orthodox Church, which continuously opposes Kosovo independence. The conflict between the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Kosovo authorities in Kosovo is not so much reflected in the state prosecution, but rather in the absence of law and legal protection for the people and objects of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Since 1999, no one has been convicted for murders of Orthodox people, including monks, and for demolition of more than 150 Orthodox churches in Kosovo. The attacks on the Serbian Orthodox churches and facilities still occur on a daily basis, and sometimes with the support of local authorities. The Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo survives only through cooperation with international security forces of KFOR. There is a constant fear among Orthodox clergy and monks that 13th and 14th century monasteries that undergone attacks and destruction by Albanian militants in 2004 will be listed in the UNESCO's as Kosovo heritage sites. The protection of the Serbian Orthodox Church rights and property in Kosovo were also accentuated in the Washington Agreement signed in September 2020 between the US President Donald Trump, the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, and the Kosovan Prime Minister Abdullah Hoti. The policy of the Serbian Orthodox Church towards Kosovo is twofold. In one hand, by its statements and action, the Serbian Orthodox Church bishopric in Kosovo strengthens democratic system, legality, and respect for the rule of law, because this is the best way to secure its rights and exist in Kosovo. On the other hand, by perceiving Kosovo as cradle of Serbian spiritual identity, with more than 1,300 churches and monasteries, the SOC strongly opposes to Kosovo's unilateral proclamation of independence and its recognition by Serbia. Nevertheless, the attitude of the Serbian Orthodox Church should not be perceived as an obstacle to the peace and reconciliation in Kosovo, but as a clear sign that offered political solutions for Kosovo are far than satisfactory, because the legitimate interests of the Serbian Orthodox Church and its people are not respected. In the disputes over Kosovo's status, the Serbian Orthodox Church was led by simple interests to have its own people protected from healing and persecution and its own property secured from destruction, as well as to see every crime punished accordingly. So far, this did not happen in Kosovo, and therefore the Serbian Orthodox Church attitude is not only that Kosovo should not exist as an independent state, but that it factually does not exist as a state at all, because it fails to protect its own people. By being motivated to protect its property in Montenegro, the Serbian Orthodox Church entered the political arena and thus indirectly contributed to the further development of Montenegrin democracy. The Serbian Orthodox Church insists on the principles of pluralism, the rule of law, democracy, and its procedures with a similar motivation to protect its own interest in Kosovo. The possible answer to the question of why would the Serbian Orthodox Church, would the Serbian Orthodox Church persistently advocate Kosovo as a part of Serbia if its interests can be protected with a democratic and independent Kosovo, may be answered by a contra question: why would democratic Kosovo insist on its own independence if the best interests of both Serbian and Albanian people may be met in the democratic union of Albania, Kosovo, and Serbia? Finally, I will tackle the issue of new Serbian patriarch Porfirije Perić, elected on the 18th of February 2021. For the first time in modern Serbian history, it was elected a patriarch who was not raised in a traditional Christian family, but who discovered Christianity on his own spiritual journey as a student in atheistic socialism. As a part of his own personal, more than familial and collective identity, Christianity has for him transformative and dynamic power, which static religions interconnected with the state, power on nations usually do not have. While being the abbot of Kovili Monastery in Novi Sad, he proved this by managing an institution that worked with and helped many drug addicts. For this first time since the Yugoslav wars, the official Belgrade and the official Zagreb have found a point of agreement in the election of Metropolitan Porfirije of Zagreb and Ljubljana for the Serbian Patriarch. One may expect that the Serbian Orthodox Church during his patriarchate will consolidate itself as a loyal partner to governments and society in building democratic and pluralistic system in the region and abroad. He stated many times that the main task of the Serbian Orthodox Church is to confess Christ as the savior of the world and not to protect Serbian national identity and interests at first place, because they should be protected by laws of those countries in which Serbs are either majority or minority. In postmodern societies, the individual and collective rights of people are not secured by belonging to privileged nation or ethnical group, as it was in early modern European empires, but by rule of law and by democratic institution. Similarly, in postmodern societies, Christian church is not a stronghold of imperial and national ideologies, and thus a rival to a state, but a transformative community of people looking for spiritual development. The present Serbian Patriarch is very aware of both these issues, and this gives much hope for the future. Thank you very much indeed.